Where do we go from here? It's the title of a book by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that I've been reading the last couple of years and the last couple of days. And it's, I think, an appropriate question that a lot of us are asking as we watch the news headlines and see cultural unrest. We see those that are protesting systemic racism and crying out for help, crying out for justice. And so we ask as people of faith, we ask as people of the church, well, where do we go from here? How are we supposed to react in these days? To be honest, I've tried to sit back a little bit. To be blunt, my guess is that what the world does not need right now is more white males in positions of authority telling other people what to do. And yet, maybe you hear this not as me telling you what to do, but simply what I've been doing, kind of what my hope is, kind of how I've been reacting. And it's in three different words that keep coming to the surface, three things that the church has done from its inception, but things that are important for us to do now, once again. The first word is lament. You know the word perhaps from the Psalms. There's Psalms of lament, those that just ask, how long, O Lord, how long must this injustice happen? One of the Psalms talks about in exile, the people of God took their harps and they threw them up into the trees to stay, because they say, we don't want to sing our songs, we want to lament, we want to sit in this grief. And I think that's one of the things that's where we go from here. We sit in that lament for a time. I went for a run this morning, and there was not a single moment in that run, or any of my runs, that I've ever taken, that I was afraid for my life, that perhaps because of my skin color, somebody might confront me, somebody might say, well, why are you in my neighborhood? As a white male, that's a privilege that I have, but for Ahmaud Arbery, he knew that very nightmare and was killed because somebody thought he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and more importantly, he was killed because he was black. We lament that pain. Breonna Taylor, when my wife and I lived in Louisville, she was shot not that far away from where we lived. She was an employee at the hospital where my dad works. We lament the loss of life. And George Floyd, of course, how many of us could watch this video or see this description of what happened and the way his life was taken and not lament, not sit in that grief and not pause. And we want it to go away and we want it to avoid, but we have to sit in it. We have to sit for a time and say, this is not right. How long, O Lord? So that's one thing that I'm doing is lamenting. The second thing I'm doing is confessing. You know, every time in worship we get together and we have this moment of confession, right, in which we say these words together and then we kind of sit in silence for a little bit. I think that's probably a good model for us today, to sit in that silence, to confess some of our own brokenness. Yesterday morning, my scripture reading, my devotional was from Matthew 22, and there's this moment in Matthew 22, this is in the week of Passion, the last week of Christ's life on earth, that this group of people came to him accusing him. They were called the Herodians, and so these were folks that you could tell by the name were more closely aligned with the political power of Herod, and of course Caesar and the Roman oppressors. And so they were Jews, but they were really more closely aligned with that political strength and that political power. And so they didn't like what Jesus was doing, obviously, because he spoke of justice and he spoke of caring for those in need. And they wanted the status quo. They didn't want things to change. And so Jesus spoke to them, and you perhaps know the rest of this story. He told them, I have to give to God what is God's and give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And I think he's asking these Herodians, these people that really are more Herod followers, political party followers, than they are believers in Yahweh. You got to make up your mind. Who are you going to be here? Who is what identity are you really going to have? Are you going to have Caesar? Or are you going to have God? Make up your mind. Who are you going to be? And so I think we have to confess the moments in which we say, the status quo is not that bad. Why don't we just, do what we're doing? It's worked okay for me. There needs to come a point where we say it's not okay to align ourselves with those who would live with the status quo, who would use Jesus' words, really as a prop for looking better themselves and political advancement. That's not what we're about. And so, I hesitate sometimes. A lot of us in white pastors in white churches point to Dr. King, especially as American Baptists, right? We say, "Oh, look, here's this Baptist preacher." Especially here's this person who went to an American Baptist seminary, who was part of the American Baptist Annuity Board when he was killed. It was American Baptist that took care of his family, and so we can say, "Yep, he's one of us." But the reality is that when Dr. King spoke, when Dr. King lived, it was a lot of white churches and a lot of white pastors, just like me, who wanted nothing to do with him, nothing to do with his vision of justice, who ran away with it, who wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so we've got to confess. We've got to confess ways that we still do that we still don't align ourselves with the values of God, but run after Caesar and the status quo that is clearly broken. To that end, I've gone back into the archives. I've looked for a sermon I preached, it's been 5 years ago now, titled, "I Am a Racist." And it was a kind of honest look at my own life and the life of the prophet Jonah, looking at how we need to confess together, how we need to name this kind of brokenness, not only in the world around us, but in our own lives and our part in the world around us. And so I've included a link along with this video so that you can go back and look at that if you want, just to kind of again be a part of a understanding of confession, how we need to confess, how we are a part of the problem and we're a part of the brokenness that surrounds us, especially if we are white. This is the time to confess, not a time to tell other people what to do. This is the time to listen and to confess. So we lament and we confess. And the third thing we do is we act. So just a couple chapters after Matthew 22 comes one of my favorite scripture passages, and one of the hardest scripture passages, I think, for us to read, from Matthew 25, in which Jesus says, "What are you doing for the least of these?" That's what salvation is all about. He says, you can say the words, you can show up to church, but what are you doing for the least of these? How are you caring for them? How are you enacting justice? And again, this is from Dr. King's book, when he says basically the same thing. He's talking to predominantly white churches when he says this. He says, that our job, our task, is to demand justice for people of color. He says this: "Love that does not satisfy justice is no love at all. It is merely a sentimental affection, little more than what one would have for a pet. Love at its best is justice concretized. Love is unconditional." So he challenges us, asks us, how might we act in these days? And one of the things that Dr. King did near the end of his life was to start kind of a movement of kind of mobilizing churches and mobilizing Christians called the Poor People's Campaign. And kind of energizing around these moral issues in society. And because of his assassination, those efforts faltered and fell apart, but have been revived in the last several years. Folks who are asking again, how can we re-ask those same questions? How can we interject this idea into a Poor People's Campaign to care for the poor, to care for the least of these, as Matthew or Jesus in Matthew's gospel reminds us. And so there's a way to kind of be involved in that. I'll also include a second link to what is an opportunity through the Poor People's Campaign here in a few weeks. They're going to have a virtual protest. You can read about it if it's something you'd like to participate in, but it is one way to act. I mean, there's a ton of different ways, and you can read about several of them, but it is one way that people of faith have chosen to say we can virtually speak out against racism, but a host of other things as well, including creation care, which is one of the things that we've talked about a lot this year in our church. And so that's an important third step, right? I mean, it's eventually, some of this will die down, right? The protests will die down and people will go back to their homes. And so the question is, what do we do then? Do we say, oh, whew, fine, I'm glad that's over? or do we roll up our sleeves and say, now it's time to get to work, now it's time to act? And so in these days, that's what I'm doing. I'm lamenting, I'm confessing, I'm beginning to ask that question, how do I act? What do I do now? And so as we work this out together, as we as a church and we as the church in America try to be who Christ has called us to be, that's maybe a word of next steps, maybe a word of where do we go from here. Grace and peace in these days.